We have 3 anatomical chapters to take care of, and we will start the first I just sent you. There's about 2 slides on 24B, which have to do with the bladder, and I'll get those for you that are there. I mean, because that's really the anatomy here is really in the kidney, and I'll go into that in just a second. So this is a very complicated chapter physiologically. It is a somewhat complicated chapter anatomically. That's why it's such an interesting chapter. And so, what are your kidneys? It's the same darn two-edged sword. We take systems that work all the time for granted. You have 2 kidneys. You could give one to somebody if they were in need. And if that 1 kidney remaining, you need about a quarter of it, and you can still function fine. But the minute it goes below a certain level, all of a sudden you go from having no even realization that your kidneys were in trouble to someone saying you're going to have to be on dialysis. And that's for the rest of your life. That's, again, we have so much built-in redundancy, so much extra space, so many extra, which you're going to come to know are called nephrons in the kidney, that until we get down to maybe less than 15% of the original factory installed equipment that functions, we can still basically have the kidneys function. The kidneys do all of these things. Water balance, as you might guess, governing how much of what, whether it's sugar, whether it's salt, whatever the dissolved particles that are in there, the solutes. Ion concentrations, again, basically restating the same thing in the extracellular fluid. Long-term acid-base, pH balance. Excreting metabolic waste, toxins, and drugs, and they have an endocrine action. That is where, when your kidneys, interestingly enough, and this is backwards, by the way, erythropoietin is the trigger to make more red blood cells. So whenever you see a PowerPoint, don't take it for granted. Combine it. I endeavor to point these out. But PowerPoints are not subject to editorial review. And renin, okay, it's important in blood pressure. So these are flip-flops. Please be aware of that. Of all of these, the one that's the single most important is here. Metabolic waste, and maybe slightly thereafter toxins and drugs. Effectively, what we do is we make toxins and drugs. The liver principally makes them more water soluble, and we excrete them in the urine. The big job for the kidney, because it's the one thing that we when we get too much of, it really messes things up, and that's nitrogenous waste removal. That's how we monitor the kidney to basically determine if the kidney is working properly. There are 2 tests, and we'll reiterate this in physiology. BUN, sometimes they say BUN, blood, urea, nitrogen, and the other is creatinine. Those are 2 nitrogenous compounds, urea and creatinine, that you have to get rid of, and you only can tolerate a relatively limited amount in the bloodstream. Those levels start to go up, it's indicative that there's a problem. Maybe it's the start of an infection. Maybe there's some kidney damage. Maybe there's some other problem. Maybe all of a sudden there's a stone that's causing a backup. And so when things back up, ultimately again, it's a plumbing problem. Yes, they would take it from somebody who had that manifested in a very nasty way. Mine was caused by a food infection from salmonella, which I almost died back 19 years ago this past summer. And I ain't joking about almost died. I think I told you they called my 87-year-old mom the day I was admitted that evening and said I was close. Yet here I am today to regale you and entertain you and tease you with all of these stories. And when I was admitted, they were approximately 10 times higher in my bloodstream. To this day, I'm sitting in the emergency room at St. Margaret's, I'd seen that doc before because we always took our kids there. He goes, well, I'd like to admit you. And I was such a mess. I was never going to say no. And he said, and Dr. Stein, I'd like to admit you into ICU. Uh-oh. Ruh-roh. I can hear Scooby going, ruh-roh. That's how important the kidney is. That's the nitrogen. Everything else you can compensate for in a lot of other ways. And nitrogen is a big problem. Okay, they activate vitamin D in a complex mechanism. We'll get into that more with the physiology of the endocrine system and vitamin D itself. And yes, some gluconeogenesis. So really, we're going to study the anatomy. They used to call it the upper and lower tract. Now anatomically, we have the kidney and we have the urinary tract. The urinary tract has very little in the way of function. It is basically the outflow of urine by way of the ureters, which start in the kidney themselves, and they are hollow muscular tubes, peristaltic action that carries the urine to the bladder, which is a temporary storage area, and eventually out by the urethra. There's 2 entries in, 1 entry out. And we all have that same equipment. It's just anatomically, as we already know, different between the man and the woman. And we will look at that, the distinction between male and female, short urethra in the female, longer urethra in the male, when we start to look at it better in reflow. I think that's where it's better talked about, because there's more relevance there. That's the only thing on the Part B slide that has to do with anatomy. So I'll get those couple of slides and show them to you. Voila. The kidneys, the ureters, the bladder are all on the back wall. They're retroperitoneal. They are firmly tacked down. So they really don't have interplay per se with all that abdominal viscera we just got done talking about. Because of the liver, the kidney on the right is a little bit lower. They're roughly the same size. They're, pardon the expression, they're kidney shaped. In other words, they're concave laterally and convex laterally and concave medially. And just like the lung, they have a hilum, or an entry area sort of within the middle of that concavity, where we have blood flowing in, blood flowing out, and also where the ureters exit and when they're way down, again, behind the abdominal viscera, down to the bladder that's there, and so forth. Okay. So, I mean, we were looking here more or less at the female anatomy, because they removed, part of the female repro system. It's there. I mean, I don't get a lot out of this other than there's a couple of kidneys. In that fetal pig, you'll feel these mounds that are quite firm on the back wall when you reach in there and touch it with an instrument. Gross anatomy. They are retroperitoneal. They are located anatomically between T12 and L5. About the upper 2/3 are covered in rib. So they, again, anything that's important has got significant bony surrounds, just like your heart and your lungs, just like your brain, just like your spinal cord. There's a significant bony enclosure. It covers most but not all of the kidneys. That's why with that lower area of the kidney is subject to trauma. So when someone's in, for argument's sake, let's say a motor vehicle accident, that's something you have to be very, very watchful of. Okay? And what we look for, the classic sign to look for is blood in the urine. If it's blood in the urine that is traumatic in origin, it's going to look immediately as red. We call that gross hematuria. As opposed to being slightly discolored, that's microscopic. That's something you typically would find with a typical urinary tract infection, or a bladder infection, or urethritis, something like that. That's not something that you jump out of your chair about. When we see red, when we catheterize somebody or get a urine specimen, believe me, react. Unfortunately, the other sign of gross hematuria is what I demonstrated, and that's consistent with bladder cancer. In my case, very consistent. So here you can see they're below the 12th rib, and you can see them protruding there. So it's not entirely protective, but somewhat. Yes, there's fascia, connective tissue that's relatively dense, anchoring it, There's fat that surrounds it. Again, a modest amount, just like the heart. Modest amount that just protects it. It's there a little bit. It's called cull in French cuisine. Cull, I believe, is the spelling fat. And they wrap, because it's got flavor and moisture, certain things in it. You just don't appreciate the fine arts of gourmet cooking. It's just, I spent a lot. I've watched every episode of Iron Chef more than once. You can get it on Prime now with commercials. And the capsule itself is very, very firm. And that's really important because kidneys get a lot of infections, unfortunately. Again, any place where you have communication between the bloodstream and exit points, you got to watch out for it. And that's one of the things we learned early on. If someone has evidence of a urinary infection, or we would cancel the surgery and reschedule it. It's like magic. For some reason, blood with damaged tissue postoperatively is very receptive to blood-borne infections. And the urine is an easy way to get in the bloodstream. Here they are located back here. You can see them. So upper and the fat protecting it, lower, susceptible to blunt trauma. Right is lower. Falls and motor vehicle, sports injuries, of course. The renal artery is the critical piece. Remember, it's wider than all of the others. It's a high pressure filter. And because of that, you got to be careful. And so this is a lot of those types of things that can happen. And this is an immediately life-threatening situation. Again, it's a little bit more, I think they prevented it a bit more when we went from the standard seatbelt to the 3-point seatbelts, and we had the shoulder part on them, because that was spinal cord injuries, this kind of trauma were related. Here's the hematuria. Surgical treatment for sure may be required. And so, again, now you're going to see, and the illustration is better than these slides. You have a cortex. The cortex is where the filtration takes place. And the medulla, which is the central portion of it. Again, cortex on the outside like bone, medulla on the inside like bone, like any one of a number of structures that are there. And in the medullary area is where you're going to see all the tubules. It has a very similar texture when we looked at lung. Okay, because really it's full of blood vessels and tubes, flexible tubes, less rigidity than the lung, because you had cartilage. There's no cartilage in the kidney. So it's very membranous. It's very kind of mushy. So blood and liquid. And our British friends enjoy beef kidneys a lot for breakfast. I know. Steak and kidney pie. Not having. Whenever I was in Scotland, I just ate fish and chips to beat the band. They were exceptionally great. Of course, my son and his best friend and his best friend's dad washed it down with copious amounts of local beers. Copious. I've never seen 3 people drink that much. Terrible. I don't know if you use this expression, and I'm drinking, and I can barely get through a beer. And I've got an inch left in the bottom of your glass. I said, well, that's enough. We're getting up. And all of a sudden they yelled at me, don't you leave a wounded soldier on the field. Have you ever heard that expression? Thank you. So drink that. My son, they're both high-level Army officers, Navy officers, career. Yes, sir. Very annoying child. So you have the cortex and the medulla. You're going to see the pyramidal design. Pyramids are interesting, is that the apex or tip points toward the hilus. Okay, this is known as the papilla. You're going to see the column separating it. I'll describe the lobes. I'll look at the pelvis, the calyces, etc. Do know the flow. This is where we'll have a couple of these flow chart questions, both in repro and in kidney. Like, you're going to see a series of collections. In this case, it's collected at something called at the tip of the pyramid, and flows through a minor calyx, plural is calyces, major calyx to the pelvis, to the ureter, and out for the bladder. Voila. Here's a real kidney, sliced the way we would slice it typically in lab. That's there. This is what I mean. Better you hear. So effectively what happens, the blood flow comes in. The wide renal artery, the blood flow travels up the columns, are the piece of tissue, so you can see the blood flowing this way. It travels in these columns in between the pyramids. Pyramids are the series of tubes and blood and tubal passageways that are adjacent to one another, that are finalizing, concentrating, processing what soon will be urine. Okay? So the blood flows up this way, arches over the base of the pyramids, and then we get all these series of teeny tiny blood vessels, and effectively it's filtering from outside to inside. That's why I'll go back and give you the structures, being a little out of sequence. So voila, the outer area defined, and starts right after the base of the pyramids, is the cortex. That's where the processing takes place. And effectively, that's where the blood is filtered. Are you ready? The volume of your blood, 99, wrong number. The vast majority of that blood is filtered out. All of the liquid is filtered out. The only thing that's left, all the plasma goes out, all the things dissolved in the plasma. The only thing that's left, other than enough fluid so it will flow, even though it's very thick, are red cells, white cells, platelets, and proteins, period. That's called filtrate. So developing that filtrate is all done in the cortex. Effectively, the vast majority of the processing is done right around this area and into these pyramids. So here you can see a typical pyramid, papilla or tip, base outward toward the external area, inwardly pointing toward the hilum or the notched area is the tip. Okay, by definition, these are the columns. This is where blood vessels traverse. So as you look, all of those are significant that are there. The capsule is on the exterior. That's that. So what happens? Effectively, that's why I showed you the blood. Let's say it goes up in this area. Blood arches over here. Eventually, that blood is going to be purified, collected by veins, and the veins are going to go back through. They're going to retrace the route, as a typical vein does, and goes back through the column, collected by the renal vein, and goes to the vena cava. So it's a very elaborate blood supply, an extensive blood supply. And because that traumatic element, because it's a high pressure blood supply, very dangerous if there's a laceration or damage and leakage there. It's coming out fast. What happens after that is the fluid, once the fluid has been processed, effectively it's collected and finalized in these pyramids, dripping out, effectively out, drop by drop at the tip of the papilla of the pyramid. It's collected by this small funnel-like structure. That is it's a series of funnels called a minor calyx. 2 or 3 of these are collected into another funnel-like structure, kind of like here, going down this way. That is a major calyx. Again, the plural for any of these is a calyces. There are typically 3 of those calyces, major calyces, in one side of the one kidney, and eventually all of these now major calyces stems are collected by yet another funnel at the hilum, or the notched area that's exiting. That is called the renal pelvis. That's the part in the alliteration, a funnel, not made out of fennel. Try to think of another one. Fabulous. Fantastic, isn't it? No one cares, Lou. You're not funny. One day before we're done in physiology, would you all periodically, one day, just laugh at all the bad jokes? Can you handle it? Yeah, but not today. You just had it. I know. Any of you had a biochem test, you're not happy. For the rest of you, you didn't have it. So it's collected there, and the stem of that final funnel is the urine. So you got it from the papilla, minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis. Whoosh, there it goes. If we're doing clinical pyelitis and pyelonephritis, I mean, the question is, what part's infected? This is bad when you have an infection of this type. This is real. I mean, you're going to die from that if it's not treated properly. So the kidneys cleanse the blood, and just as competition, the renal arteries, are you ready? A quarter at rest, sitting there right now. Or if you're in that car accident while you're driving, a quarter of your blood totally is going to your kidneys. Each minute, more than a liter, about a liter and a quarter. Better part of a quart and a half of blood going into your kidneys. They flow, and I'll show it to you again, through that wide renal artery, and effectively it segments and goes in between the lobes and arches over. I'm not going to go crazy about that. Arcuate, whenever you see the term arcuate, it means it's arched over. And it arches over the base of the pyramids, and then it radiates out. When you say radiate, it goes like, and you're going to see it more closely, sort of points out, and then eventually it's collected. Where it all shakes, and really where everything is about, is what's called the nephron. And we're going to take a look at that and what constitutes the nephron and the glomerulus. That's really the vital anatomy. This is gross anatomy. So here it is again. So if you can't, it's not easy to blow it up, but these are the arching arteries, and then eventually they're going to radiate out from the arch straight, and then they're going to have little branches that go horizontally or sideways or at right angles to that radiating artery, and that's where they're going to form a capillary bed that is critical and unique in the human body. Unique is important. It's the only place we got them. Voila. So this is really one of those interesting areas, and it's circled here or enclosed here. Aorta, okay. Renal artery, fine. Segments, goes up the lobes, arches over, radiates. By this point, it's gotten smaller. Now we're getting to arterioles. And now you're going to see we have an afferent arteriole leading into the glomerulus and an efferent arteriole. Wait, time out. The only place in the body where you have an arteriole coming in and an arteriole going out. Normally, when you enter into a capillary bed, what happens? Oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange, nutrients go out, waste products come in, we have to expend energy, okay, all of that good stuff. And any other capillary bed in the body, like the next one, all of a sudden, the red arterial blood becomes blue venous blood. So WTF happened here. Why is it not? Okay. Now you're going to see why it's a high pressure filter. The glomerulus is a filtration apparatus. It does not rely on concentration gradient. It does not rely on additional ATP. Since we're not sucking the oxygen out of this, for purposes of ATP, the oxygen stays into it. What's driving this particular bus? Pressure. It's a filter. It's almost like a gravitational filter. It's like me making coffee in the morning, or you making coffee in the morning. We put the water in, the water gets heated up in the typical drip system, drip, 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 and gravity takes it through the filter, and it extracts, which is what it does, and it extracts all the goodies out of those ground coffees And unlike this morning for mine, typically should leave the grounds in the filter. My filter flopped. Hate that. Got it? That's why. So we're relying on pressure. Remember I said it's a high pressure filter. Now, once that filtrate is created, now when we do the exchange, okay, let's keep all the glucose. No, get rid of all the potassium. Oh, we better keep the sodium. Oh, I got enough chloride. Get rid of some of it. Blah, 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 blah. All the bad guys go out, all the good guys stay in. Got it? That takes energy. We've got a whole bunch of mitochondria that need energy to do those processes. That's why once it goes through what are known as the peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta, which means straight vessels, that you can see over here, if this cursor ever makes an appearance. Here, now leading out of the efferent arteriole, now we're effectively going to cleanse the blood, keeping in what we need, getting rid of what we don't want, and eventually it will return to the venous circulation. Voila. Which brings us to the nephron, of which there are about 1 million per kidney. So there are two main parts. We'll look at both the renal corpuscle and the renal tubules. There's a number of illustrations that are there. The glomerulus is a tuft of capillaries. What's unique, relatively unique, these are, you might remember, fenestrated capillaries. They have little holes. They're perforated just like your filter paper is for the coffee. Just like that strainer you have when you get the grounds in there and you want to get them out. You run it through that, through a sieve, as it were. A colander if you're making pasta. So you're wise and have a pasta insert for your big, shut up, nobody cares. We invest in kitchen gadgets. Oh, who wants me? I'm in class, you douche. Excuse my middle son. He calls me religiously at this time, and he knows I'm in class. So the capillaries, a fenestrated epithelium, very porous, it's holes, filtrate, plasma-derived fluid, again, everything, all of the plasma, all of the stuff dissolved in the plasma, no proteins, because they're too big to get through the holes, no what we call formed elements, red cells, white cells, platelets, because they're too big to get through the holes. Okay? And so effectively what you see, it's another system of funnels. You hadn't had enough funnels to make you sick by this time. So here you have a vessel coming in, a nest of capillaries, and a vessel going out. This is afferent, this is efferent. Incoming, outgoing. And in here, it's surrounded by a cup-like structure. Kind of like this. And as it works its way, it's like a spritzer. You know, it's like you put the water in, it's like you have I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Like you put it on the end of your hose, like your garden hose, and you have your plants. So you want it to, and so what happens is it's going through that, whatever you put at the end of the hose, and you can control it. You want it heavy stream, you want it to be like raindrops, you want, that type of stuff. Effectively, that's what that does. So it works its way, there's more pressure, it works its way through here and out, and finally filters all that stuff. The proteins in the cells, formed elements, red cells, white cells, platelets, and enough fluid so it will flow, so the blood is comparatively thicker. If you want to think of it that way, exit by way of the efferent arteriole still with its full complement. And the filtrate goes that way. Goes out for processing. The name of this cup-like structure is called a capsule. Everybody refers to it by the first name of the person who identified it, called Bowman's capsule. So it's a cup shape, surrounds the glomerulus. It has layers. This is where you can go crazy. Simple squamous is the lining in the interior, like almost like any vessel, but around that capillary bed, it's got interesting little cells called podocytes, because they have these foot processes, and they can kind of control the flow and the openings, like how much actually comes out. And a lot of that's how we control our fluid levels and our blood pressure. The longer we keep stuff in there, the more fluid is produced. The quicker we let it through there, the less fluid. If you have high blood pressure, if you're over volumed, okay, you want to let it go through there slowly so you can get rid of it. Basically, the kidney controls itself. If your blood pressure is in a wide range, it's only extremes, like when I was very sick, and the bottom basically had fallen out of my blood pressure. And I went into it. We got a word for that. It's called shock. In this case, it's called hypovolemic shock. And so it allows filtrate to pass into the capsular space. So they show you just some of these illustrations. This is what I mean. These are little openings. These slits are controllable. The little holes, the fenestrations are here in the lining cell of the capillaries. These slits play a role in allowing a lot of fluid or a little fluid to come out. And then it enters famously, this is a structure anatomically, it's very famous, the tubule structures. They're only about 1.5 inches long, less. Okay? Single layer of cells, but each region has its own unique histology, appearance, and function. They're called the proximal convoluted tubule, because it's first. Convoluted, because it has all those twists and turns. It looks a whole lot like one of those gag straws. If you get someplace that has the straw in there, it's got the... You got one of those like at a fair type thing or whatever. You go to those like the church fair, the kiddie rides and all that stuff, raffles. Funny stories. While you're doing that, we're at flea market trying to find stuff people don't know is worth a lot of money. Proximal convoluted tubule, closest, they call that capsule and glomeruli corpuscle. They have the loop, also known as the loop of Henle, capital Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule. And you'll see they're very close together, but it's all about closest to the glomerulus apparatus, farther away. And they go into multiple what are called collecting ducts. I know there's a lot of anatomy, and I'm almost done with it for today. So, and again, it's a little bit, most of the processing we will go back to in physiology occurs here. Proximal convoluted tubule, a lot of mitochondria, okay? So it's like this you can tell a busy cell when there's a lot of mitochondria. And again, look at all those microvilli, surface area, just like we learned about in digestive. The loop has a thin descending limb. That's because it's impermeable to water, and a thick ascending limb because it's not permeable to water. We will get into that in understanding the hardest part of function is how the urine gets concentrated. That is some hard stuff. And then distal convoluted tubule, less microvilli, more about spitting stuff out than reabsorbing it. We're going to get into all those things. Yeah. And so it's a classic looking, you'd never mistake, there's nowhere else in the body where it looks like this histologically. You take a cell sample. This is that space. Remember, it's a capsule. So here's the glomerulus. The capsule is surrounding. It's the only place, and these are all tubules. Tubules basically have simple columnar, simple cuboidal. You see how the nuclei are around? They have a lumen that's there. That's classic kidney. So, and I don't worry about principal cells and intercalated cells. That's more function. The collecting ducts receive the filtrate. So you're going to see multiple areas where collecting ducts effectively, when it enters into the collecting duct, it's urine. It's been processed. and then it's a matter of just excreting it from there. So I'll show you the illustrations much better. This is a better view. The structures are much more tightly packed together. These loops and these collecting ducts, all of those are next to each other. They've only fanned it out here so you can see the distinction. Personally, like the distal convoluted tubule and the loop here are very, very close to this area, as you'll see subsequently. So you have blood going in. The input is always wider than the output. We control blood flow there. So the afferent is wider than the efferent. That's significant to know anatomically. Here, it sort of rapidly goes around there, or slowly spits out filtrate. The filtrate's collected by the capsule. This is proximal convoluted. Then the thin descending loop, the thicker ascending loop, distal convoluted, and it goes into one of many entries. So there could be a dozen, 20, 100 nephrons going into each one of these tubes. These loops and these collecting duct tubes make up those ribs that you see on the kidney, if you go back to that previous illustration. 85% of these are located in the cortex out here. About 15% of those nephrons are located right next to the medulla. These do most of the processing, bring back sodium, bring back glucose, bring back this amino acid, get rid of this toxin, get rid of this potassium. These are all about water. Reclaiming water to concentrate the urine. So here's what they look like. I'll leave this as the, yeah, we can go through it. Another slide. I gotta leave one part of it alone. Here, invested around, these are called peritubular capillaries. They're all around the convoluted tubules. Not a lot around the loop. It's very small. The reason is this is the one that's absorbing and secreting chemicals that it needs to retain and chemicals it needs to get rid of. And so once it's collected by the peritubular capillaries, 85%, it becomes venous blood. Different here. Scant blood vessels. They're all draped around this very, very long loop. We've become very familiar with that appearance. It has a lot to do with how we concentrate urine. They're called straight vessels or vasa recta that are there. So glomerulus, peritubular capillaries, juxtamedullary, vasa recta. And so all this, the arterial and afferent enters, the efferent leaves. Blood pressure is high because the afferent arterial is larger, and afferent and the arterials are very high resistance, meaning they can cope with high pressure. So much so your blood pressure would be 200 over 120. That's really very high. Okay? And yet your body could still, so most of the adjustments we make in blood pressure, we don't have to do anything about it. We call it auto control. So we delve into that in physiology. The peritubular capillaries, very porous, water and solutes, okay, cling to all those tubules. Okay, the vasa recta, parallel that long nephron loop. Okay, they really don't have the peritubular capillaries. They're all about constant. And you can see this is a great micrograph to show you what it looks like. You have that. And those are the glomeruli, those capillary beds. You can see wide afferent, narrow efferent. Okay, very significant. That's there. And there's the same illustration. And that's where we're going to stop it. I don't want to do the JGC here. This is really important. This is about how we, and it's really the last significant piece of anatomy for this. So I'll send it to you and I'll introduce probably male reproductive in this. And my voice is dying. And have a wonderful turkey. Thank you.